My lungs were screaming for air that was never coming. I watched through a haze of agonizing paralysis as my own mother, Sante, violently yanked my ventilator cord with a look of chilling, focused calculation. "Enough, Venus! You're always faking it!" Dante bellowed, his voice drowning out the sudden, terrifying flatline scream of the monitor. My heart stopped. The world went white. And as the code blue alarms blared, a doctor's voice cut through the chaos like a jagged blade. This was not an accident. But before the darkness could claim me, the sterile hospital glare bled into a sickeningly familiar, golden light. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a cathedral of gold leaf and crystal, a space designed to amplify the importance of people who already felt like the center of the universe. To anyone else, the air smelled of lilies and expensive perfume. To me, it tasted like filtered lies and vintage champagne. I stood near the velvet-draped pillars, clutching the Young Analyst of the Year trophy. The crystal was heavy, cold, and sharp-edged. It didn't feel like a reward for 3 years of 80-hour weeks. It felt like an anchor dragging me deeper into a sea of people who only saw me as a shadow. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who claimed to love you, yet felt like you were completely invisible? I watched my father, Dante, the CEO of Bradley Global, holding court near the stage. His smile was a masterpiece of corporate branding, wide, white, and utterly hollow. Beside him, my mother, Sante, glided through the crowd with the predatory grace of a woman who had spent 30 years turning social status into a weapon. They didn't share love in this family. We shared interests. We shared quarterly projections. And tonight I realized with a sudden icy clarity that I was an asset they no longer knew how to value. I looked at my older sister, Xanthi, laughing at something a senator said. She was the golden child, the one groomed to inherit the throne, while I was the one kept in the back rooms to make sure the numbers actually made sense. I had discovered things in the books, irregularities, offshore movements that didn't align with our fiduciary duties. I thought they would be proud of my diligence. I thought they would want to fix it. How naive I was. Real wealth isn't what we hold in our banks, but the peace we keep in our hearts when the world tries to rob us of our identity. I wasn't at this gala to be seen by them. I was here because I had earned my place through blood, sweat, and a moral compass they had long ago traded for a yacht. I stepped forward, hoping for some parental pride. Sante stopped me before I could reach Dante. She didn't hug me. Instead, she reached out and adjusted the emerald necklace I was wearing, an heirloom that felt more like a necklace to me. Her grip tightened so much that the gold links dug into my neck, leaving a dull ache. "Darling," she whispered, her breath tinged with mint and gin. "Try to stay in the shadows tonight. This is an important announcement from Xanthi. Don't let her brilliance be overshadowed by your little accounting trophy." She patted my cheek, a gesture more like a slap than a caress, then turned back to her guest without waiting for a reply. The music suddenly faded, replaced by a low, expectant hum. Dante took the stage, the spotlight reflecting off his silver hair like a halo he hadn't earned. I stood there, heart hammering against my ribs, expecting a nod to the audit I had perfected. Instead, the giant LED screen behind him flickered. It didn't show the annual report. It showed a medical file. My name was at the top in bold black ink. Diagnosis: histrionic personality disorder. Symptoms: pathological lying and attention-seeking behavior. Dante's voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with a rehearsed, sorrowful concern that turned my stomach. "As many of you know," he began, pausing for a dramatic sigh, "my youngest daughter, Venus, has been struggling with deep psychological issues. It pains us to say that she has been manufacturing financial discrepancies within the firm as a cry for help." He looked directly at me, his eyes as cold as the Lake Michigan wind. "For her own safety, and to ensure she receives the treatment she deserves, the board has voted to strip her of her seat and voting rights, effective immediately." The room went silent, a vacuum of shock that was quickly filled by the frantic scratching of socialites' whispers. I felt 500 pairs of eyes boring into me, some with pity, others with the cruel satisfaction that only the elite feel when they see one of their own fall. Sante was dabbing a dry eye with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the heartbroken mother with an Oscar-worthy performance. Xanthi didn't even hide it. She stood in the front row, a smirk playing on her lips. Her victory complete. My hands began to shake, the crystal trophy feeling like it was made of lead. I remembered a piece of wisdom my grandfather once told me. The greatest test of character isn't how we act when the world is cheering, but how we stand when the people who gave us life try to bury us alive. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply walked to a passing waiter, set my trophy down on his silver tray, and left it there. It didn't belong to me anymore. Nothing in this house built on lies did. I met Dante at the base of the stage as he stepped down. He expected me to beg. He expected me to have a breakdown that would prove his point. Instead, I looked him in the eye with a clarity that made him flinch. "You haven't protected the firm, Father," I said, my voice steady and quiet enough that only he could hear. "You've just declared war on the only person who was willing to save it." I knew exactly what this was. Under the Illinois Probate Act, by labeling me mentally unfit, they were attempting to invalidate my findings on their offshore accounts. It was a legal execution. I turned to Sante, who was watching us with narrowed eyes. "I hope the image you're protecting is worth the daughter you're losing," I told her. "I forgive you, Mother, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry the weight of your bitterness into my future." I saw the flicker of rage in her eyes, the rage of a woman who realizes she no longer has a leash on her prey. This was my boundary. I was leaving the gala, the firm, and the family that viewed me as a liability. I walked out of the Drake Hotel, the heavy brass doors thudding shut behind me. The Chicago winter hit me like a physical blow, the sleet blurring the city lights into a smear of neon. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a burner phone I had hidden weeks ago. I dialed a number I knew by heart. "Vance, it's Venus. They did it. They played their hand. Start the clock." I walked toward the valet, my breath hitching in the freezing air. I climbed into the car, the interior faintly smelling of new leather and my mother's cologne, a lingering scent from the last time she drove. At the time, I didn't realize my brakes had been tampered with. I didn't know that my forgiveness came with a death sentence. I only knew that after 27 years I could hear myself thinking. The tires hummed a treacherous lullaby against the asphalt as I swung the sedan onto Lakeshore Drive. Behind me, the golden glow of the Drake Hotel vanished into a jagged gray smear of sleet and lake mist. The Chicago skyline, usually a beacon of ambition, now looked like a row of broken teeth against the bruised sky. My knuckles were white as I gripped the leather-wrapped wheel, my chest still tight from the public execution of my reputation. It's funny how the world keeps spinning even when your own has just been leveled. A person's true height isn't measured when they are standing on a pedestal. It is seen when the ground is swept from beneath their feet. I didn't hate Dante for the lies he told on that stage. I pitied him. I pitied a man who believed a forged medical file could permanently hide the sun of the truth. He thinks he's erased me, but you can't erase what you never understood. I glanced at the passenger seat where a small, tattered teddy bear sat buckled in, a childhood relic from the grandmother who had been my only real sanctuary. That bear was the only thing in this car that wasn't a product of corporate posturing. The freezing rain began to turn the highway into a sheet of black glass. I focused on the road, my mind already mapping out the meeting with Vance. Then the dashboard flickered. It was a microsecond. A stutter in the digital clock. A ghost in the machinery. A small icon I had never seen before flashed. System overriding. My heart skipped a beat. Ahead, a delivery truck swerved slightly to avoid a patch of ice. I reached for the brakes to create distance, but the pedals sank to the floor without a whisper of resistance. It felt like a sponge, soft, unresponsive, and terrifyingly useless. Panic is a luxury I couldn't afford, yet the coldness of the blood in my parents' veins felt more dangerous than the storm outside. I pumped the brakes frantically. Nothing. The car didn't slow, it surged. 80 miles per hour, 90. The engine roared, a mechanical beast feeding on its own momentum. I wasn't driving anymore. I was a passenger in a 4,000-pound coffin. The smart drive system, a point of pride for Bradley Global's fleet, had turned into a digital executioner. Suddenly, The infotainment screen glowed a sickly, bruised violet. The car's speakers crackled with static before smoothing out into a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't Vance calling to check in. It was Sante. Her voice was calm, melodic, and terrifyingly domestic. She sounded like she was settling in for a Sunday brunch rather than presiding over a murder. "Venus, darling," she said, her tone as light as a summer breeze. "You always were so difficult. We simply can't have you ruining Xanthi's future with those pesky audits. It's better this way. A tragic accident for a troubled girl. Close your eyes. It will be over soon." The doors locked with a sharp, synchronized thud that echoed like a gavel. I looked at the camera lens embedded in the rearview mirror, knowing she was watching the terror she expected to see. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of my breakage. Instead, I stared straight ahead into the blinding sleet. "Mother," I said, my voice steady despite the vibration of the steering wheel. "The shadow you've cast over my life ends tonight. If I die free of your lies. But if I live, I will be the mirror you can never stop looking at. You've underestimated the strength of the daughter you tried to erase." The car hit 100 miles per hour. The steering wheel jerked under the command of an invisible hand, aiming me directly toward the concrete barrier overlooking the icy black depths of Lake Michigan. This was a clear violation of every federal cybersecurity law. A blatant act of premeditated murder executed through a corporate server. They weren't just killing me. They were using my own tools to do it. But they forgot one thing. I was the one who performed the risk analysis on these vehicles. I reached beneath the dashboard, my fingers searching for the hidden manual override cable, a physical failsafe that bypassed the software entirely. I felt the cold metal of the ring. With a guttural cry, I yanked it. The steering loosened just enough. I couldn't stop the speed, but I could choose my impact. I ignored the bridge pillar and aimed for a bank of soft snow and a cluster of heavy industrial trash containers. The world exploded. There was a cacophony of shattering glass, the violent punch of white airbags, and the acrid smell of ozone and burnt rubber. I felt the car roll, a slow-motion somersault that ended with the sickening crunch of the roof caving in. Then, silence. Only the sound of the sleet hitting the mangled metal remained. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my body pinned by the steering column. The scent of lavender from the gala was gone, replaced by the metallic tang of blood. Through the cracked windshield, I saw the headlights of a trailing car slowing down. My first thought wasn't for my own survival. I prayed for the driver behind me. Please don't let them get hurt because of my family's sins. Even as the darkness tried to claim me, I refused to let my heart turn to stone. A figure silhouetted against the sleet approached the wreckage. It wasn't Vance. The man wore a dark hoodie, his face obscured by the shadows and the falling ice. He didn't reach for a door handle or call for an ambulance. He held out his phone, the lens reflecting the red glow of my broken taillights. He was recording. He leaned into the shattered window, his breath visible in the freezing air. He didn't offer a word of mercy. He whispered my name with the cold precision of a hunter checking his trap. "Venus," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They told me you were a ghost. Let's see how long it takes for you to disappear for real." My heart stopped for a moment, a hollow thud in the silence. The party was just the beginning. The real battle had moved out onto the streets of Chicago, and I was bleeding in the midst of it. That was the moment everything changed. I was no longer just a girl. I was a survivor. And survivors are the most dangerous people on Earth because they have nothing left to lose. The transition from the wreckage on Lakeshore Drive to the emergency room was a blur of jagged sirens and the smell of ozone. I drifted in a suspension of consciousness, aware of the cold Chicago sleet melting against my skin before the heavy, pressurized warmth of the hospital took over. The ER at Northwestern Memorial was a sensory assault of fluorescent glare and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. I lay trapped in the locked-in state of a trauma patient, fully conscious beneath a paralyzed exterior. My mind became a high-definition recorder of the shadows dancing on the ceiling tiles. I could feel the plastic of the ventilator tube in my throat, a necessary intrusion that felt like a lifeline. I wasn't Emma or any other girl. I was Venus, the youngest Bradley, the one they thought they could break without consequence. Sante and Dante were ushered into the trauma bay minutes later. I heard the distinctive click of my mother's heels before I saw her. She was sobbing, a loud, performative grief designed for the benefit of the nursing staff outside. But as soon as the heavy privacy curtain swished shut, the weeping stopped, as if a faucet had been turned off. I felt her presence loom over me. Her perfume, something expensive, floral, and suffocating, clashed violently with the hospital's sterile air. Her face, when she leaned into my field of vision, was a mask of cold, calculating stone. Dante didn't even touch my hand. I heard him pacing near the foot of the bed, his breathing heavy with irritation. He didn't look at my bandages or the bruises blooming across my ribs. He stared at the heart monitor as if it were a fluctuating stock ticker. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Venus," he growled, his voice a low vibration of pure resentment. "Did you total that car just to force us back into your life? Get up. We know you're faking it." Within the silence of my mind, I felt a profound, weary realization. For some, love is a debt they simply refuse to pay, and I was merely the bill they tried to burn. I didn't feel the heat of anger, only the cold clarity of a soul finally dividing itself from its tormentors. A house divided against itself cannot stand, but a soul divided from its abusers can finally begin to heal. Before I could even process the threat, Sante's hand moved. It wasn't a gentle caress. I saw her fingers, trembling not with fear, but with a dark, focused adrenaline, reach for the ventilator tubing. With a violent, jerky motion, she yanked the cord free. She disconnected the source of my breath while her eyes remained locked onto mine, watching me as if I were a candle she was desperate to blow out. The air in my lungs vanished instantly. My chest heaved in a silent, desperate scream that no one in the bustling ER could hear. Dante stood guard at the edge of the curtain, his back to the monitors. "Enough with the theatrics!" he snapped, his voice a jagged edge cutting through the sterile room. "Stop holding your breath and face us like an adult." He was gaslighting a dying woman. The monitor began to scream, a long, continuous, agonizing "tit" as the green line on the screen flattened. My heart stopped. I felt my consciousness drifting into a vast, white void where the physical pain finally ceased. In those 3 minutes of clinical death, I saw the truth. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me to never have existed. The code blue alarm blared, a frantic electronic pulse that mirrored the chaos of my life. The curtain was ripped open with such force the rings rattled. Doctors and nurses flooded the small space, physically pushing my parents aside. Dr. Sterling was the first to reach the ventilator. I saw his eyes widen in shock as he looked at the floor, seeing the disconnected cord lying far from where it could have accidentally fallen. The resurrection felt like a bolt of lightning. The crash of the defibrillator paddles sent a surge of fire through my soul, dragging me back from the white light. My heart stutters, finds a ragged rhythm, and settles into a hollow thud. I was back, but the Venus who died in that void stayed behind. The woman who returned was a warrior cloaked in silence. I lay there, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, as the medical team stabilized my vitals. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I just watched. As the chaos settled into a low hum of activity, a shadow fell over the doorway. It was Vance. He didn't look at the doctors. He looked directly at Santi, who had instantly reverted to her fainting mother routine. Without a word, he dropped a heavy plastic evidence bag onto the bedside table. Inside was a receipt and a photograph of a black couture funeral dress and a prepaid cemetery plot at Graceland. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Funny thing, Santi." Vance's voice was like a shovel hitting dry earth. "The timestamp on this purchase is Thursday afternoon. 2 days before the accident happened. You weren't hoping she'd pull through. You were just waiting for the event to catch up to your wardrobe." He leaned in closer to my parents, his voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "This was not an accident, and neither of you is leaving this hospital until I get some answers." Dr. Sterling bent down, checking my vital signs with an unreadable expression. He looked at the breathing tube, then at Santi, then back at me. I saw thoughts swirling in his eyes. He was standing in a room teeming with predators. Vance's presence was like a shield, the only thing separating me from my inhumane relatives. I closed my eyes, a single tear of relief rolling down my cheek. I forgive the mother who gave me life 27 years ago, but I will never again allow the monster she's become to take it away. They think they're the predators in this theater of cruelty, but they've just walked into a room full of mirrors, and the reflection is about to become their undoing. I drifted in a twilight zone where time had no meaning, only the rhythmic, hollow hum of the ICU monitors. The ventilator was gone, but in its place was a heavy, suffocating silence that felt like a physical weight on my chest. I was a prisoner in my own skin, locked in, behind eyelids that refused to obey my command. My ears, however, were wide open, catching every tremor, every whispered betrayal that drifted through the sterile air of the private wing. Real power is not the ability to move. It is the ability to remain unmoved when the world is shaking. I lay there, absorbing the clinical atmosphere of Northwestern Memorial, reflecting on the profound emptiness of the people who shared my DNA. I didn't hate my parents for the cruelty they displayed in the ER. I pitied them. A soul that requires another's destruction to feel whole is a soul that is already lost to the dark. I was simply the bill they were desperate to avoid paying. The room was bathed in the cold blue light of the vital station. Suddenly, the silence was punctured by the soft click of the door. A figure entered, moving with the jagged, nervous energy of a thief rather than a grieving father. I focused on regulating my breathing, keeping it steady and shallow, masking the surge of adrenaline that threatened to spike my heart rate. I was no longer a victim waiting for a miracle. I was an observer, a silent witness collecting every piece of evidence for the day the reckoning finally arrived. Dante approached the bed, but he didn't reach for my pulse or offer a father's touch to my brow. Instead, I felt his cold, sweaty palms grasp my limp, bruised right hand. There was no warmth in his grip, only a desperate, trembling urgency. He pulled my thumb toward the glowing glass of a private tablet he had smuggled past the nurses. He wasn't here to say goodbye. He was here to conduct a digital grave robbery while my body was still warm. I felt the slight pressure of the scanner against my skin. A soft, clinical beep echoed in the quiet room, signaling authorization. With my biometric signature, he was bypassing every security layer I had built. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was transferring $5 million in crypto assets into a blind offshore account in the Cayman Islands. These were the funds I had earmarked for the company's pension stabilizers, the safety net for hundreds of families. By stealing them, he wasn't just betraying me. He was committing a federal crime under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The physical touch felt like a brand, a final desecration of the bond that is supposed to exist between a father and his child. "Just a small loan, Venus," he whispered, his voice thick with the pathetic justification of a coward. "You won't need it where you're going, and it will keep the board off my back for another month." I wanted to scream, to lash out at the man who had turned into a scavenger, but I held my peace. I thought to myself, I forgive you for the money you steal, for paper and code can be replaced, but I will never let you steal the sanctuary I've built in this silence. The door opened again, and the heavy scent of Sante's perfume flooded the room. She wasn't alone. I heard the hesitant footsteps of Dr. Sterling as she practically herded him toward the life support rack. The performative mourning of the gala was gone, replaced by an icy, sharp-edged authority. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She cornered him right there, her voice a blade that cut through the humming machines. "We both know about the Mercy Hospital incident 10 years ago, Doctor," Sante said, her tone as conversational as if she were discussing the weather. An incorrect dosage, a cover-up, a family that was paid to disappear. My connections kept your license intact back then. It would be a shame if those records suddenly found their way to the medical board tomorrow morning. I heard the sharp intake of breath from Dr. Sterling, the sound of a good man being dismantled by a monster. He was my only anchor in this storm, my only hope for a neutral witness, and now I was hearing him being forced into a corner. Sante's demand was simple and horrific. She wanted him to administer a high dose of a long-acting paralytic agent. She wanted me stable, conscious and alive, but unable to signal or move. until the $15 million insurance payout cleared the mandatory waiting period. The moral weight in the room was suffocating. I felt a surge of compassion for the doctor, seeing him trapped in a house of mirrors where every exit was blocked by my mother's malice. He was being forced to choose between his career and a patient who appeared to be a vegetable. She's stable enough, Sterling stammered, his voice thin and cracking. But another dose of that magnitude, it's unethical. Unethical is losing your livelihood over a decade-old mistake, Sante countered, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. Do it now. Keep her quiet. Keep her still. We just need a few more days of silence. I felt Dr. Sterling approach my bedside. His hand was shaking so violently I could feel the vibration through the mattress. He looked down at my closed eyelids, and for a moment, I wondered if he could see the screaming light of my consciousness behind them. He reached for my IV port with a preloaded syringe. Sante stood directly behind him, a dark silhouette of predatory patience, watching her orders being carried out. I felt the cold, sharp tip of the needle brush against the plastic of my port. This was the moment of truth. If I broke my cover now, if I struggled or cried out, I might stop the injection. But I would lose the only advantage I had, the fact that they believed I was a mindless vessel. But if I stayed silent, I would be plunged into a chemical tomb, aware but utterly helpless while they finished their work. I had to decide. Do I gamble on a compromised man's hidden courage, or do I take the leap into the dark? The most dangerous place wasn't the rubble, but the room where everyone thought they had won. I awaited the bitter taste of the medicine, my mind screaming into the void, hoping that someone, somewhere, would hear what I couldn't say. My mother's compassion was like a needle filled with silence. The paralytic agent Sante forced Dr. Sterling to administer had turned my body into a cold, marble statue. Every muscle was a leaden weight, a physical prison that barred me from the world of the living. Yet beneath this forced stillness, my mind was a raging wildfire, bright and untamable. I was the silent spectator of my own funeral arrangements, trapped in a twilight of medical pings and the dry scent of hospital linens. I could hear the rustle of Sante's silk skirt as she paced the room, a sound like a snake moving through dead leaves. In the heavy, suffocating silence, I returned to the ancient wisdom my grandfather had whispered to me. He who has a reason to live can endure almost any hardship. My reason was the burning truth in my unblinking eyes. They could freeze my limbs and silence me, but they could never reach the sanctuary of my thoughts. True endurance is not about resisting the waves, but about becoming an ocean they cannot shake. The room was a stage for psychological horror, and I was the only audience member who knew the script. I used the absolute stillness to map their every move, learning the sharp cadence of Sante's footsteps and the nervous, rhythmic tap of Xanthi's heels. I wasn't a victim awaiting a miracle. I was a vault, recording every whispered confession for the day the doors finally blew open. Have you ever had to listen to the people you loved talk about you as if you were already a memory? It's a pain that either breaks you or turns your soul into diamond. Sante walked toward the window, the morning sun casting her shadow long across my bed. She called Xanthi over, their voices dropping into hushed, jagged tones that dripped with malice. They spoke of home care, an elegant euphemism for taking me to the isolated family estate in Hinsdale. I knew that house. It was a fortress of shadows where no doctors would interfere with a second, successful attempt to pull the plug. They were planning my exit strategy while I was still warm. The insurance investigators are asking too many questions about the ER, Santa whispered, her voice a chilling breeze. They need her to die at home, Xanthi. A complication from the trauma. Something quiet. Something final. I heard the tremor in my sister's voice, a mixture of greed and a fading scrap of conscience. Xanthi asked about the $15 million payout, her words proving she had fully traded our shared history for a seat at the table of the elite. Even in that moment, as they plotted to erase me, I felt a profound, heavy sadness for Xanthi. I didn't hate her for being weak. I was sorry she never learned that a sister's loyalty is worth more than all the gold in Chicago. My lack of malice was the only thing they couldn't anticipate. Sante leaned down then, her cold, dry lips brushing my forehead in a mockery of a mother's kiss. It's almost over, Venus. she breathed into my ear. Soon you'll be as quiet as you've always pretended to be. Her words, initially like a death knell, became a catalyst. The irony in her mockery fueled my resolve to break free from the chemical shackles binding my nervous system. I channeled all my strength into the tip of my right index finger, resisting the suffocating grip of the drug. The truth doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. It only needs to exist until the lies vanish. I am not a ghost. I am the punishment they did not expect. Sante wasn't finished with her theatrics. She produced a folder, the sound of the sliding paper echoing like a blade being sharpened. She spoke of a forged toxicology report she planned to leak to the press and the Chicago PD. It claimed I was on high levels of unprescribed sedatives during the crash, a narrative designed to invalidate Dr. Sterling's testimony. They wanted to paint me as an addict who had caused her own accidental flatline in the ER. I focused on controlling my autonomic nervous system, keeping my heart rate steady so the monitor wouldn't betray the fury blooming in my chest. By framing me as an addict, Sante was attempting to trigger the moral turpitude clause in our grandfather's trust. If successful, my entire inheritance would be diverted to her as the next of kin. It was a clean, legal execution of my future. I thought about the families depending on those pension funds and knew I couldn't afford to fail. As the two of them prepared to leave, Xanthi lingered by the bed for a heartbeat. I expected her to show a sign of regret, perhaps a final look of sisterly love. Instead, I heard the faint snick of a camera shutter from her bag. She wasn't checking on my vitals. She was recording Sante's movements, securing her own leverage for the inevitable day they would turn on each other. It was a house of mirrors where every reflection was a predator waiting for an opening. That was the moment my last illusion crumbled. I wasn't just rebelling against my parents. I was trapped in a spiral of generational greed that ultimately claimed my life. But as the door closed, leaving me in the dim darkness, I felt a new power. A one-armed ghost pulling the strings of justice. I just had to wait for the right moment for the light to return. The humming dark of the ICU had become my sanctuary, a place where the chemical chains on my limbs finally began to feel less like a prison and more like a cocoon. I sat in the center of that silence, my mind sharper than it had ever been, waiting for the crack of light that would signal the end of my interment. That bridge arrived in the form of Dr. Sterling. He entered my room late Wednesday night, his footsteps heavy with a guilt that no amount of socialite money could erase. He didn't look at Sante's security cameras. He looked at me, and for the first time our eyes met in a silent pact of survival. Without a word, he began to work, his fingers moving with the precision of a man seeking redemption. He bypassed the hospital's main server and installed a high-speed eye-tracking interface directly onto my medical monitor. Suddenly, the screen in front of me wasn't just a graph of my fading vitals. It was a keyboard. It was a portal. It was my voice. I felt a surge of empowering energy, a rise from the ashes sensation that sent a phantom warmth through my paralyzed chest. My gaze became my weapon. I flickered my eyes across the digital keys, navigating through the corporate cloud of Bradley Global with the ease of the expert analyst I had always been. That was when I discovered the first jagged shard of the truth. Xanthi, my own sister, hadn't just been a passive observer. She was a strategist. I accessed a hidden, encrypted folder on her personal drive and found the raw footage from the ER. The moment Sante yanked my ventilator, along with years of recorded conversations where my parents discussed their liability daughter. She hadn't kept these to save me. She had archived them to blackmail Sante for her own inheritance claim. The realization hit me like a physical blow, even as my body remained a statue. My sister had watched me die for a seat at a table that was already rotting. Yet, in that digital silence, I found a stoic clarity I didn't know I possessed. Forgiveness is not about letting the guilty off the hook. It is about refusing to let their darkness dictate the tempo of my future. I decided right then that I was no longer a patient. I was the ghost in the machine, and I was preparing to dismantle a kingdom built on sand. Thursday morning arrived with the clinical chill of a Chicago winter. Across town at the historic Palmer House, Dante was preparing his greatest performance yet. He had organized a massive televised charity fundraiser, using my tragic vegetative condition as the centerpiece to solicit millions in donations. It was a masterpiece of deception, designed to cover the $5 million he had embezzled using my thumbprint while I was flatlining. The cinematic contrast was almost unbearable. I watched through a hacked feed on my monitor as Dante stood on a magnificent stage, weeping under the golden spotlights in front of the city's elite. He spoke of the light of his life fading away, while I sat in a dim, smelling room, my eyes flickering across a keyboard of light to authorize a live stream hijack that would change everything. Justice is truth in action, and today I would be the hand that tipped the scales. I watched Dante reach the climax of his speech, his voice cracking with practiced sorrow as he prepared to announce my transition to permanent care, the legal trigger for the $15 million insurance payout. The donors in the room were reaching for their checkbooks, their faces etched with the kind of performative empathy that my family had traded in for decades. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the girl in the ICU was a ghost he had already laid to rest. Then, the world shifted. Just as Dante opened his mouth for the final, devastating blow, the giant LED screens behind him glitched into a bruised violet static. The ballroom fell into a stunned, vacuum-like silence. The fundraiser's audio cut out, replaced by the rhythmic, hollow hiss of a hospital ventilator. Slowly, the static cleared, and my face appeared on every screen in the hall, sharp, conscious, and undeniably alive. The livestream confession wasn't a speech. It was a revelation. I didn't need to say a word. The footage Xanthi had hidden spoke for me. The 500 elite guests watched in frozen horror as Sante's hand violently yanked the cord in the ER. They watched the biometric log pop up in a split screen, showing the exact timestamp of Dante's thumbprint theft while the monitor behind him showed my heart had stopped. The emotional momentum in the hall turned into a tidal wave of shock. I stared into the camera from my hospital bed, my gaze steady and unwavering. I wanted them to see that I wasn't a victim, but a consequence. I wanted Sante and Dante to feel the exact moment the ground they stood on turned to dust. The donors began to stand, the room erupting into a cacophony of gasps and outraged whispers. Dante turned to the screen, his face drained of all color, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. The atmosphere in the hospital was electrified. I could almost hear the sirens before they started blaring. As the police began wailing outside the fundraising hall, the video showed Sante lunging toward the camera, yelling that I was a digital hallucination and the product of a broken mind. But her voice was cut short as she turned and saw Detective Vance emerge from behind the stage. He didn't say a word. He just held up a pair of steel handcuffs that reflected the cold digital light of my face on the screen. The fundraising event ended not with thunderous applause, but with the sound of a world crumbling. I watched Vance lead them away, the silks and gold and jewels becoming meaningless in the face of reality. I turned off my computer and let the screen continue its steady ping. The darkness in the room no longer felt like a prison. It offered a sense of stillness before a new dawn. I sat there in the dim light, the ghost within the machine finally finding peace. The Bradley family empire was crumbling, not with a loud bang, but with a quiet sound. 2 weeks had passed since the fundraiser at the Palmer House, and the world outside my hospital window had shifted from the gray sleet of betrayal to a crisp, clear Chicago morning. I sat in a wheelchair, my breath no longer a struggle, watching the light catch the mahogany panels of the Bradley Global boardroom. It was a cathedral of high finance, a place where I had once been a ghost, and where I was now the only one who could truly speak. The silence in the room was heavy, not with the humming of medical monitors, but with the suffocating weight of an empire's final hour. Dante and Sante sat across from me, out on bail and looking older than I had ever seen them. They were flanked by a phalanx of high-priced defense attorneys, men with expensive watches and hollow eyes who were already preparing a last-ditch character assassination. They whispered about deep fakes, digital manipulation, and a mentally unstable daughter seeking revenge. I looked down at my hands. They were still, resting quietly on my lap, a sharp contrast to the frantic shuffling of legal pads and the nervous clicking of pens from across the table. My father leaned in, his face a mask of desperate arrogance that had carried him through 30 years of corporate warfare. "Venus, be reasonable," he said, his voice a low, threatening vibration. You sign the non-disclosure agreement, you retract that ridiculous video, or we sue you for corporate sabotage and the theft of proprietary family secrets. You'll be tied up in court until you're 50, and you won't have a cent to your name to fight us." He still thought he could bully the girl who had survived his wife's hand at her throat. He still thought money was the only language I understood. I looked at him with the clear-eyed pity of a doctor observing a terminal illness. Have you ever realized that a man who lives a lie eventually becomes its prisoner? He was so exhausted from trying to move the mountain of truth that he couldn't see it was about to bury him. I didn't feel the heat of anger. I felt the cool, steady air of a woman who no longer needed their validation. "I am not here to fight you, Father," I told him softly, my voice echoing in the mahogany silence. "I am here to let you go. The war is over, and you are the only ones who didn't know you'd already lost." My attorney, a man who had been my grandfather's closest confidant, placed a dusty, notarized folder on the table. Inside was the sovereign clause, a hidden addendum to the Bradley family trust that my grandfather had drafted decades ago. He had seen the rot in his own son, the creeping greed that eventually consumed Dante and Sante. The clause was a failsafe, specifically designed to protect the legacy from fiduciary malfeasance and moral turpitude. It was a legal hammer that neither of them saw coming. Under Illinois trust law, the documented murder attempt in the ER and the biometric wire fraud triggered an immediate, irrevocable freeze on every corporate asset. The lawyers across the table froze as they read the fine print. By their own actions, Sante and Dante had automatically removed themselves as trustees. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was the sole controller of Bradley Global, not because I had sought power, but because the architect of the firm had trusted my integrity over their greed. I watched Sante collapse into her chair, her socialite armor finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. She looked at the cameras in the corner of the room, still worried about her image even as her world turned to dust. I didn't gloat. I didn't take pleasure in her ruin. "I will not see you in prison, Mother," I said, the words heavy with a mercy they had never shown me. "If you accept a permanent exile, I will fund your living expenses in a modest home far from the city, provided you never speak my name, never contact me, and never return to Chicago." The room remained silent as the weight of my words settled. Closure doesn't come from an apology. It comes when you decide you no longer need one. I realized that the most powerful thing I could do was become invisible to them, to deny them the energy of my anger or the hollow comfort of my presence. I refused Xanthi's half-hearted attempt to push my wheelchair as I headed for the door. She was still looking for a way to stay relevant, but I was already moving toward a horizon they couldn't reach. Months later, the Chicago cold was nothing but a memory. A cinematic transition had taken me to a small, sun-drenched balcony in a coastal town where the air was clean and the silence was entirely my own. I looked at a faded photo of my grandfather and thought about the diabolical path I had walked to get here. A heart that can forgive is a heart that can finally rest. I wasn't the victim daughter anymore. I wasn't the analyst or the ghost. I was simply Venus. I picked up a pen and looked at the blank page in front of me. I wasn't writing a thriller. I was writing a guide for those still lost in the dark houses of their own families. Have you ever wondered what it takes to choose peace over a war you are destined to win? I looked out at the ocean, the blue stretching out into an endless, quiet power. I chose myself. I chose the light, and in that choice, I found the only sovereignty that ever mattered.